Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are around the globe. Thanks for joining us for our webinar series, Personalized Medicine 2.0, an integrated approach to true personalized medicine adoption. I'm Mark Reese, Executive Vice President of Business Development at Diaceutics, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We've got some great presenters and some really good content to share with you, but before we dive into the agenda, just a few housekeeping notes. You'll all see in your panel at the very bottom, there's a question box. And at any time during the presentation, you can go ahead and ask a question just by typing it in there. And we'll get to all of your questions at the Q&A session at the end. Also, today's slides will be available via PDF. So you can email me and I'll send you the PDF. You'll see my email at the end of the presentation. So in terms of the agenda, what we'll do is we'll really give you a sense of what Diaceutics does, the difference between PM Personalized Medicine 1.0 versus 2.0. We'll share some new exciting data from an international physician study around personalized medicine perspectives, and we'll discuss how you all can leverage personalized medicine in your strategies today, Personalized Medicine 2.0. But before we start, we're going to launch a quick poll, and just to get a sense of the audience, we've got over 100 folks in attendance today, and you can look at the question, which is, are you implementing personalized medicine today? And please go ahead and vote. We'll look at the results here. So the majority, about 70% of you are, 30% of you aren't. And let's ask the folks that are you optimizing your strategy? Do you feel like you've really got it optimized? Wow, so the opposite, so about 85% say not optimized. Very interesting. Well, thanks for sharing those results. I think that one of the key things in terms of what Diaceutics is focused on is really an integrator of personalized medicine for the pharmaceutical and diagnostic clients. We leverage consulting, software, service solutions to standardize planning, analytical, and action steps needed for successful development, commercialization, and the launch of targeted therapies. And one of the things that, in terms of our model and what we see around integration, we've really got on this molecule five key areas in the molecule. In the center, you see the consulting arm and the IT platform that we have. We've got 4 other areas on the molecule, and starting on the top right, going clockwise, Diaceutics is a global lab network that helps optimize the implementation and commercialization of companion drugs and tests. Diaceutics, on the lower right, is a patient empowerment solution focused on personalized medicine, and that's going to be launching late this year, early next. Diaceutics, if you keep going in clockwise order, the partnership between Diaceutics and CAHG, a leading healthcare communications agency, and Suri Harris will be talking a little bit about some research they've done a little bit later. And Diaceutics was created to really address the key gaps in personalized medicine communication. So we help pharma incorporate diagnostics into physician and patient communications, which really enables the ownership of the testing moment, which is critical, and ultimately establishes personalized medicine as a separate pillar along efficacy, safety, cost, and convenience. And then lastly, up on the top left, we help with diagnostic and therapeutic partnerships, so pharma partnerships between diagnostics and pharma companies. Lots of those are happening today, and we really help make those a seamless partnership. So where are we today in terms of personalized medicine? And I think a lot of you were probably at ASCO last weekend, lots of exciting news that came out of ASCO. In terms of quantifying the market today, we've got a lot of interest and excitement. So the latest data in 2012 shows we're up to about 70% of pharma's pipeline integrating personalized medicine, and there were about 72 target therapies. So a total value of $24 billion. And given the pipeline, we're looking at a tripling of therapy assets that will need a PM-focused approach to commercialization over the next 3 years. So that's pretty impressive. But in order to get there, PM really needs to evolve. And Tiffany Olson is going to give us a sense of how things are moving from the current 1.0 to the future 2.0. So Tiffany is chairwoman of Diaceutics Advisory Board and was most recently the vice president and global head of diagnostics for Eli Lilly and Company. And she's responsible for developing and implementing its diagnostic strategy and providing innovative solutions to enable the integration of diagnostics into pharmaceutical development for personalized medicine. And prior to that, Tiffany was the president and CEO of Roche Diagnostics Corporation. Tiffany?
Thank you, Mark. And Mark, are you able to get these slides on? They are not showing on my screen, and I'm not sure if they're showing on others.
Oh, great. Yeah, we'll just
wonderful. I just have the poll up, but not the slides.
Okay, thanks. Do we have those up now?
Not yet.
Okay. How about now?
Great. Wonderful.
Perfect.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you, Mark. What I wanted to do in order to set the stage for where we're going in personalized medicine, I kind of wanted to start out with where we are currently in this whole journey. Now, I remember one of the very first personalized medicine presentations that I gave. It was back in 2000, and it was when I was with running the Roche Molecular Diagnostics in the USA. And there were really very, very few stories that we were able to talk about, or companies that were involved in this area. It was really kind of at the very beginning. And most of them centered around metabolic pathways. We were just starting to talk about CYP450 and the ampla chip at that time. But if you fast forward now, 13 years later, there's been much more activity. There was a recent study, and that's what's on the screen, that was done by Omnicon, and this occurred late last year, where they did a survey of over 800 doctors, both in primary care, cardiologists, and oncologists that you see. And they asked the question, what 3 companies do you believe are at the forefront of personalized medicine? And I think there's kind of 2 interesting takeaways here. First of all, if you look at the primary care and cardiologists, about 30% of them couldn't think of any. So we still have a long way to go. But if you look at oncologists, where really, I think we can all agree that most of the personalized medicine discussions and development have occurred, you can see that the companies, Genentech, Genomic Health, Myriad, really come to mind. And there's just very few that can't think of any. I'd like to say that I think it's also interesting that these 3 mostly work in the breast cancer area. And so it's good to see that at least there's one disease area where personalized medicine comes to the forefront of many people's minds. But, I think the real question is personalized medicine really just a drug and a companion diagnostic? Is that really the end game? And our question that we ask ourselves is really, are we competing for the wrong finish line? And our view is that, yes, we are, that this really is just the first level. Next slide. So where do we need to go? Well, today, we feel that the definition for personalized medicine is way too narrow. Most people and companies in the process are defining personalized medicine just really as an asset. It's the molecule, the biomarker with a particular drug, and it's centered too narrowly. And we need to look at it in a much broader definition. We need to define it as being patient-centric, really looking at how the patient in their journey with a disease enters the system and all the different mechanisms that touch them. For instance, we all know that diagnostics can screen, it can be part of staging, there can be prognostics associated with it, drug response and monitoring, both in vivo and in vitro. So in looking at this, we really need to deal with the entire continuum of personalized medicine throughout that patient's disease and looking at all of the tools that are available. Next slide. So to get to the real promise of PM 2.0, we believe we need a different model. So what are the differences between 1.0 versus 2.0? Well, first of all, what we see in the current system is that pharma is really losing their influence on how those drugs are and when those drugs are utilized. The FDA is telling them what to do. We have next-gen sequencing with other diagnostic tests. Influences. And that's causing a lot of vacillation and uncertainty. And part of that, as we all know, is that the stakeholders are sorely misaligned and also some underemployed. So for instance, we have doctors, laboratories, diagnostic companies with pharma all misaligned, and even diagnostics with laboratories with LDTs, what's going on there, especially with, I'm sure most of you saw the FDA's comments recently on the LDTs. But what that's done and what we're saying is that it's paused because we have such this narrow focus, and that now we need to look at what 2.0 means. And what we believe is that there's got to be new levels that are forming with this cooperation to really reach the full potential. It's a higher level of integration, and someone has to take the lead. People that adopt this business model early are going to be able to shape the future of what PM is going to look like in the future. Those that integrate will be the winners in this situation and really need to understand what that's going to look like. Again, it's focusing on that patient pathway and on the complementary diagnostics where that patient enters in and all of the tools that need to be used in that journey. And Peter, when he talks, is going to go into much more detail on this, but I just wanted to tee that up for everyone so that you could be thinking about that as the conversation and the discussion continues. So I will turn that back over to Mark.
Thanks, Tiffany. Really appreciate it. Now, Suri Harris is the Executive Vice President of Strategic Planning and New Ventures at CAHG, and she's going to share some research with us. And CAHG is one of the largest healthcare communication companies in the world. They provide brand acceleration services such as advertising and promotion, genomics-based medicine and personalized healthcare strategy and communications, and clinical trial patient enrollment and management. CAHG is a part of Diversified Agency Services, a division of the Omnicom Group, and is the lead U.S. agency within the TWA World Health Global Network of Marketing Communications Firms. Suri?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Mark. As a follow-up to a U.S. physician study that we implemented in 2010, we recently fielded a new physician study in Q3 of 2012, both in the U.S. and in the EU, regarding awareness, attitude, and adoption of personalized medicine. We had an online survey of 446 physicians, 204 in the U.S., 242 in the EU, including France, Germany, and the UK. And we included oncs, neuros, cardiologists, and PCPs. Not surprisingly, our findings 2 years later were not very different from the study that we implemented in 2010. The same gaps, unfortunately, still exist, but they also offer opportunities for industry across all stakeholders. Next slide, please. So if we begin with number one, the knowledge gap, physicians acknowledge that there's significant benefit and value to personalized medicine in general, as well as for their practice, but not surprisingly, they have very low knowledge and education, both in medical school and beyond, about this emerging area. Next slide. So when we ask them, how familiar are you with current issues and advances in genomics-based medicine, we found very low familiarity. 35 to 40% of the total were not very familiar or not at all familiar with advances in personalized medicine, which typically isn't a response that you hear from physicians when you ask them about a therapeutic category. Oncologists did fare somewhat better. 25% of oncologists in the US were very familiar. 40% of oncologists in the EU were very familiar, but the remainder were somewhat or even less familiar. So that was somewhat disconcerting from the oncologist perspective. And next slide. So what does this knowledge gap lead to? It leads to a pretty major confidence gap that impacts adoption and utilization of personalized medicine. So why typically we have confident professional physicians, but they're now expressing significant lack of confidence in many of the aspects of genomic-based medicine. And this was both in the US and the EU. So next slide, please. So what were some of these concerns? They have concerns with several of the aspects of testing. When we ask the question, when it comes to personalized medicine, I am concerned about, and as you see here, the number one concern related to the test precision and the insufficient precision of the test results, but a whole other grouping of concerns related to choosing the right patients for the test, choosing the right test, and choosing the right therapy. Another area of concern had to do with tissue issues, and that was choosing the right lab, getting the right tissue sample for testing, and waiting too long for test results, which was particularly of concern to oncologists, which was interesting. About half were concerned about their ability to interpret the test results. And this was, in general, in the US, trended to have more concern than the EU overall, and PCPs, neuros, and cards tend to have more concern than oncologists. But still, across the board, we did find concerns in these areas. Next slide, please. Personalized medicine also posed concerns vis-a-vis the physician-patient communication and interaction. So we asked again, when it comes to personalized medicine, I am concerned about, and the number one concern, both in the US and the EU, was the potential cost to the patient. Another major area that surfaced was concern around time issues, and that was the time that it takes to find out if the test is covered, the time and resource for my staff in my practice or my department, how long of an office visit it takes, because they don't feel that it's long enough to actually explain all about molecular diagnostics, companion diagnostics, test results. It's a whole new paradigm for them. A whole other new area of communication that we're finding that is being posed by personalized medicine relating to ethical issues. And one of the concerns that surfaced among all the physicians were the ethical issues related to withholding a therapy if the patient is not a candidate based on their genetic profile, which is a whole new way of communicating to a patient that physicians are not prepared for. In addition, they say they do lack confidence to converse with patients in a language that they can understand when it comes to personalized medicine, as well as dealing with these new anxieties around the area of personalized medicine. And not surprisingly, privacy issues are a concern, which actually raises the question in the US, has GINA been adequately communicated to the community? The Genomic Information Non-Discrimination Act that was passed several years ago. Next slide, Mark. So the big question is, are these gaps being filled? And there is a resounding no. Despite a high desire and willingness of the physicians to be engaged in the area, it appears that all stakeholders across the board are missing these opportunities. Next slide. And this is a chart that just screams out opportunity to all stakeholders. We asked the question, where are you currently receiving information about genomics-based medicine? And where would you like to receive this information? And we did a gap analysis. And as you can see, we found a major gap between current and desired information sources. This chart is for the US, but it was very similar in the EU. In the interest of time, I'll just point out a few of these gap areas. Key opinion leaders. There's a desire by 80% to get their information from key opinion leaders, and only 27% are currently receiving that information. A major opportunity here for industry to cultivate opinion leaders in personalized medicine. I'll also point out pharmaceutical companies and molecular diagnostic companies are coming up short in terms of providing this information to the HCPs. So there are major gaps across the board for all stakeholders. Next chart, please. Okay, that's the bad news, but the good news is that communication from industry is greatly welcomed by the professional community. When we asked, would you be interested in receiving the following, and this was both in the US and the EU, overwhelmingly, they would welcome information from pharma and diagnostic companies. That includes non-promotional education and websites. But as you can see in the third line here, it also includes a rep call. So almost 2/3 would welcome reps. And this is in an era when, as we know, physicians are moving actually in the other direction. But as we saw in the previous gap slide, less than 30% now are citing that they're receiving industry information. Another interesting question that we asked was, are you interested in participating in clinical trials in the area of personalized medicine? And over 70%, again, across the board, US, EU, and all specialties, 70% expressed high interest in participating. Next slide, please. So what does this all lead to? Well, we believe there are major opportunities for industry as well as all stakeholders. We know that personalized medicine has the potential to transform patient outcomes, but we also know now that physicians in clinical practice are not well prepared for the revolution, and they're unable to advise their patients and to communicate. So opportunities abound. Number one, to educate the key stakeholders, but there are also opportunities to implement practice accelerators, and that would include overcoming several of the barriers that we identified in the previous slides, including areas in testing and patient selection, interpretation of results, time and resource management, as well as physician-patient communication issues. And certainly, there is opportunity to optimize marketing and sales effectiveness. As we said, reps from industry are welcome and coming up short now. And finally, as Tiffany showed in her first slide, there's an actually major opportunity for industry to seize a leadership role in this area. Back to Mark. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Suri. Very, very illuminating. So I'm going to introduce Peter Keeling, the CEO of Diaceutics. Peter brings over 24 years of experience in international healthcare, having directly initiated and managed the launch of 4 pharmaceutical, 7 OTC, and 5 diagnostic products, in addition to 3 joint ventures and 2 major joint corporate marketing campaigns. In addition to Peter's extensive operational experience in the US, he has substantial experience running operations in all key healthcare markets. So Peter, I'll go ahead and and move your slides to you.
Okay, that's great, Mark. Thanks so much indeed. And I think, as Mark mentioned right at the beginning, coming off of the exciting announcements that all of us, perhaps in the personalized medicine area, have been watching at ASCO, and the very current debate that is ongoing. I think the slides that Suri has been through and the comments that Tiffany made earlier on really for us represent a little bit of a wake-up call that despite the efforts, despite the great science that is being brought into play, I think we have all need to work a lot harder in order to actually bring those into play and to integrate them in a way that is responsible. But what I wanted to do in a few slides was actually move this debate a little bit further forward. I wanted to roll it forward and really look at what integration means and also what the business model for that integration is. Because one of the questions that we are constantly asked as we sit down in front of diagnostic and pharmaceutical clients is, we all see the vision of what personalized medicine is going to do. What we cannot see so readily is actually what that translates into in terms of activity, in terms of responsibility, and most importantly, in terms of return on investment. So what I want to do is to dive right into initially some of the financial dimensions here. And what you see on this slide is, our view, I suppose, of the one-size-fits-all blockbuster model, which is a relatively low price per patient for treatment, but that your return on investment is coming from a volume of treatments. As we move, next slide please, Mark, next tab. As we move into the personalized medicine domain, how we've employed this is almost like the orphan drug model. What we've in essence done is to price our therapies high because the volume of patients that we're getting are low. So our pursuit of return on investment has come from really ramping up the cost per patient. And, that works when you only have, a couple of drugs in an individual disease state. Next slide. Where it doesn't work is when you start to add on layers and cocktails of therapies and indeed move that out of oncology and into other disease areas. It is simply not affordable. And I think we've already started to see some pushback by payers who have, in essence, have said is there is a limit to how many of these personalized medicine drugs that we're going to be able to afford, let alone the diagnostics that are accompanying them. Next slide. And when you see some of the headlines surrounding, for example, those excellent launches, the brilliant science that's being brought to play. Here's an announcement around Xalkori. The headline is less about how this drug is going to transform the patient's life, and the focus is being shifted towards the cost and the actual expense. And in our view, and I think probably in many of your views, this is really the wrong emphasis. We don't want personalized medicine to be associated with cost. If you remember in Suri's slide, one of the questions that was asked was, what are you worried about? And they're worried about the expense and the cost of this. And in our view, that debate is misplaced. It's not representative of where we want this to go. Next slide. So what I want to do is to kind of change the paradigm a little bit and let us stand back and assess really what is going on in this as an industrial model. And this is a slightly complex slide, but bear with me, please. And what you have here is a kind of an accelerated timeline along the bottom where we've moved from empirical medicine over the last decades right through evidence-based medicine. Maybe we're currently in an era of translational medicine, but there's something else out there. And what you see on this particular line is representing the speed of innovation that is going on. And when we had long industrial cycles, very heavy investment by the pharmaceutical industry, to really come up with new therapies and new drugs, the speed at which that hits the clinic is modest and low. What we're seeing today is with the arrival of genetics, with molecular information, with the shift of data and communication into the hands of the translational scientists and the clinicians who are sitting at the bedside, they're being able to make observations and determinations that really change how those treatments are being used, right down to the point of being able to apply treatments for patients when the actual drug label isn't indicated for that disease. So we're really seeing a shift, an acceleration towards that bedside innovation, and all of us, I think, are probably witness on a daily, if not a weekly basis, to the quantum and the dialectic that's going on within the personalized medicine community and the physician community about the breakthroughs that are going on. Not necessarily breakthroughs on treatment, but breakthroughs in terms of the application of information. And we represented in the slide one from the Mount Sinai Hospital, where they've recently installed or switched on their supercomputer Minerva, which is part of the filtering of the quantum of information, as well as patient history, as well as risk profiles, so that they are really aiding clinical decision making. But the upshot of that is that that level of rapid translation of information at the bedside will change decisions. Next slide. So what's the so what from this? Well, there's several so whats. The first one is that in the yesterday model, when we had long cycles of industrial innovation, the pharmaceutical industry had very strong influence in terms of how those treatments would be used. Obviously, in the design of clinical trials, in the application of guidelines, all of those were the instruments at which there was a clarity around how their therapy is going to be used. Shift that all the way up to the present day, and all of a sudden now we start to see that there are other players interfering with that traditional model, whether that be the regulators who are stepping in and saying, we are observing potentials to change these labels, either because of safety concerns or some other genetic or molecular information, and we will change those labels. Or, as we've seen in the case of Erbitux, where it was the research community that stepped in and said, we see a patient subset here for this therapy, it's much more relevant, we're going to publish that data, and it pushed the pharmaceutical company onto the back foot. Now, I think we're a lot wiser to this, but I think what our view is that we can expect a lot more of this type of disruption as we're moving forward. So what's the solution? Next slide, please, Mark. And in our sense, in our view here, there's really a systems integration gap. And what we mean is that the building sites and the diffusion and dislocation of stakeholders that Tiffany alluded to at the very front end of this discussion are, yes, they're talking to each other, but they're not integrated. We're not joining the dots in terms of how this information is going to play out for the individual patient. And of course, the question then comes is, whose job is that? Whose responsibility is it to step in and create that level of integration? Next slide. So one of the things that I think we have done in Diaceutics is to look beyond this current paradigm and say, what does systems integration look like in healthcare, and why is that relevant in personalized medicine? Now, systems integration is not a new concept in healthcare. It's been around for a while. Here's a publication by JAMA illustrating its importance. But what I think is almost a timely thing is that the changes and the role and the abundance of information that's coming in and around molecular and genetic guided decisions allows us an opportunity to change and to get much more involved in that level of integration. Next slide, please, Mark. And we see there's various levels of model that we can look at integration. We can either be a component supplier here, where we have developed the drug, or we've developed the test, or we are a practicing clinic or some level of clinical group within that. And that's a legitimate place to be. We can decide to stay there. Or we can become a subsystems supplier where we're bundling some of those packages. I'm going to show you what one of those looks like in a minute. Or we can move right up to the top of the tree and become that integrator of a solution, most likely in an individual disease area. We're not talking about this as a a panacea in every disease. We're basically saying is for those diseases which most warrant that level of integration, there is an opportunity to step in, and that opportunity is to play out for the individual patient. Next slide. Now, we're already seeing some levels of that middle tier, those subsystem integrators. And what's interesting is that level of integration is not coming from the diagnostic industry, not coming from the pharmaceutical industry. It's coming from those translational scientists, those people who are at the bedside. Here's a site. I encourage you to go and look at it. It's been developed by Vanderbilt. It's open to oncologists. And it in a sense, it's doing one thing very simply. And it's presenting, it's allowing clinicians to look at the so what of the genetic profile that their diagnostic panel or their genetic assessment has done. And it's presenting that information saying not just, here's the drug that's indicated for that particular genetic status, but here are some of the clinical trials, and here are some of the other science that's going on in that area. And what it's doing is putting a level of integrated information into the hands of physicians and allowing them to make informed treatment choices. And it's a very exciting observation to see, and it is our view that we will see more and more of this level of integration of multiple pieces of information. Who integrates? And we really, in our view, don't see good examples of integrators in the healthcare industry today. There are some examples, but not to the level of integration that we've seen in other industries. And so what we've done is we've looked outside our own industry to look at who integrates and what does an integrator look like. And here is an example, Lockheed Martin, who we all would be familiar with in the defense industry, but perhaps not so familiar with the fact that Lockheed Martin don't just build tanks and airplanes. They get involved in training. They get involved in making sure that there is a diffusion and an application of the technology in the field on behalf of the Pentagon. And so it's our view that this is the type of model that we need to apply to unlock the promise of personalized medicine. Next slide. So the next question is, so what? What's that worth? Where's the return on investment for that? And we represented here a first slide of where the level of wasted cost is represented in the US healthcare system. And here what we've done is highlight those areas, in terms of waste, those areas where personalized medicine theoretically should be able to play a role, in shifting some of those costs. Unnecessary services, inefficient care, and indeed prevention failures. But what we want to do was to take that one step further, bring that down to a pedestrian level and an observation at the disease state. Next slide, please. And what we've got here is a representation of a shift of costs in one disease area. The example we've chosen is melanoma, and we've looked at what might personalized medicine 2.0 do in a melanoma context. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What's going to happen? The starting point here is the current distribution of costs. Lots of information on the slide. Let me draw your attention to just a couple of very salient points. And that is, when you look at the patient distribution on the top left-hand side, you see that a small number of patients at stage 2, 3, and 4 in melanoma basically absorb the vast majority of the resources that are applied. And a lot of that is coming from the fact that those patients are being managed late. They're being managed at a second stage, and they're being both surgery and treatment costs are being ramped up at that case. So if you look at the next slide, please. What we've done is to look at a couple of scenarios which in our view are realistic. And what's our definition of realistic? They're realistic because we could see treatments and diagnostics being applied based on the research that is happening today. They could be applied in a much more integrated fashion. Not just the companion tests. Remember, Tiffany said it's not just a narrow definition, but looking at how diagnostics can complement the patient pathway. And you're probably reading this slide as we speak. Let me talk a little bit about the scenario on the left, where what we've done is saying is, let's imagine a situation where we could actually find and identify patients who are currently outside the treatment pool. So the first thing we're going to do is put more patients into treatment. Second thing is we're looking at diagnostics that can really identify what's going on in that disease, the high-risk patients, at a much, much earlier stage of that disease. These tests potentially exist today. They're just underutilized. And that combined with the design of clinical trials for targeted therapies towards first-line treatments of those patients could have a profound impact in shifting the clinical outcome for those patients. And also in these models, we've looked at a potential redistribution of revenues to other stakeholders outside of the drug model, so that they too are active participants and are incented to really make the shift. And what we've looked at two scenarios. One is the marginal shift, and the other on the right-hand side is we've looked at something which is much more transformational, where we've really ramped up the potential impact. Let's look at the next slide, what the impact of that is. A couple of analyses I want to show you here. The first is what's the clinical impact? And you can see that in our view, an integrated approach to personalized medicine, where you really are looking at all those component parts, plus the level of education that is required that Suri spoke to, would have a potentially profound impact on this disease. You would have more patients diagnosed, much lower levels of second-line surgery, where, if you remember, the primary costs are lost. And much more patients being treated at first line, where clearly the potential outcome are higher. And finally, a lower number of deaths. So that's theoretical model, a theoretical, an aspiration, if you like, of what is going on. Let's look at some of the cost redistribution. And here you can see on the left-hand side, the current cost burden in melanoma in the United States is $12.6 billion. And actually what our model is saying is we're going to have to spend more money, obviously, because we're putting more patients into the treatment pool. We're looking at applying treatments to patients at first line. So we're going to be spending more money on diagnostics and more money on chemotherapy. But the benefit of that is that we would be shifting the cost away from the surgery in hospitals, which is the most expensive cost component here. And indeed, we would be managing surveillance through a combination of monitoring tools, etc., and reducing some of that cost. So the best outcome that we could potentially expect here is that there are some winners, and indeed there are some losers. But one of the greatest winners is not just the clinical outcome, but obviously that the revised cost burden goes down. And so the payers, again, are active participants here. And there it is, represented in a slightly different schematic. So our point here is that not only is the potential benefit of personalized medicine 2.0 something that is, a scientific goal or a technical goal, it also can and potentially should be a financial goal, something where we really integrate around the potential cost benefits and the cost savings applied to the patient here. Next slide, please. So let's just take the next tab for me, please, Mark. Let's just kind of stand back from a second what we're saying. A couple of things. First, healthcare innovation is shifting towards the bedside. I think we're seeing clear evidence of that, and it's having consequences for the industrial players at the table here. The way we've defined personalized medicine 1.0 today, the way we've priced the therapies is one that's adding cost, and it's adding concern at levels of at the physician, at levels of the payer, and at levels of the patient. And it's not, I think, what we all set out to do with this vision of personalized medicine. Yet, what is near at hand, with a shift of emphasis, with a shift of approach, what we can do is to reach to this better model. And it's a model that is not it's not aspirational, but requires a level of integration between the multiple players and the multiple stakeholders at the table. Next slide. So what are we doing in diaceutics? How do we approach this from a point of view of helping our clients to think and think outside the box about this? And we've developed a series of what we would define as integrated solutions, which really allow our clients to look at each of those building blocks of how personalized medicine is playing out. Next slide. And some of those components are applied to integrating this internally within pharma, allowing executives and leaders within pharmaceutical and diagnostic companies to really look at what are the right questions we should be asking and where. Because the design of integration in personalized medicine doesn't start at phase 3 and what we've done is to step forward and create a series of tools that allows those decisions, those simulations, those models to be opened up and observed much earlier on. And the power of an informed executive, an informed leadership team within personalized medicine, it will do the rest. In addition to that, what we've added are a series of adjacent services. Here we've added a laboratory network currently focused in the EU but growing globally, where we've attempted to integrate one of the most important stakeholders at the table for us here, which is the laboratory. And we've, to date, reached out to roughly 160 laboratories. Next slide, please, Mark. And what we're asking those labs to do is to help us help our pharma and diagnostic clients move beyond that narrow asset-based, one drug, one biomarker focus, but rather to really integrate that into laboratory practice much faster and accelerate the time to get these into clinical use. And you can see here we've got a series of tools again and levels of education that are important to help those laboratorians be active participants at the table. Next slide. No, pass that one, Mark. I think the next one, and very relevant that Suri and CHG are at the table with us here today, because one of the things that we've done is to set up in partnership with them to approach this communication challenge that we've all identified. And here you have on the slide a paradigm of yesterday and tomorrow. Yesterday, great drugs, Elboraf launched, a lot of fanfare, a lot of application, but I think the opportunity to change the communication paradigm for this personalized medicine drug was missed. On the right-hand side, I think what we're starting to see emerge quite exciting is that a recognition that the personalized medicine journey for patients and physicians often starts with a test and not the treatment. And so it's putting an emphasis on who would you test, how would you test, and addressing those information gaps that Suri alluded to first and foremost. Our view is that not only in integration, but in terms of physician practice, it's that change of emphasis and change of approach which is going to be important. And the so what of this is that concepts that previously were unknown in the one-size-fits-all model, what we've defined here as propensity to prescribe. Propensity to prescribe is that conversion of someone who is test positive onto the desired therapy. That propensity to prescribe and that conversion rate is entirely a function of the confidence around the testing, the speed at which that testing is delivered, and the information that is integrated to the physician. So there's a huge incentive, I think, for us to get involved and look at how that converts into actual treated patients. And it's very important, even in some of those paradigms that we have in Herceptin, etc., where we actually look at why are we losing patients? Why have they not all converted over? Another assessment that we've done is we've really looked at the patient dialogue that is ongoing. And on the left-hand side, we've been monitoring and observing what is their view generally of the traditional drug model. And to a large extent, their view is negative. They're suspicious. They're worried about big pharma. They're concerned. What's exciting is that when you look at the change of emphasis in the discussion that's going on around the targeted therapies, A, the frequency of discussion is higher, and B, is that their view is either neutral or much more enhanced. So even from a patient point of view, despite that paucity and that level of information that we put out there today, there is an excitement, there's an understanding that something is happening here, that a drug has been developed for their particular disease set. Next slide, please. So, key takeaways. Personalized medicine, in our view, as Mark said right at the beginning, is set to become a predominant model. Today, one of the concepts is this is an oncology thing, it's a niche. When you look back at the treatment path, at the pipelines within many of the pharma industries, and you look at the level of activity that's going on within the molecular diagnostic industry, you can be sure that we are at the cusp and at the tipping point of a changed paradigm. So this is not an if anymore, it's a case of when. And our view is that pace is accelerating. However, that our current way of looking at this is too asset focused. It's too focused on that individual drug and the individual companion diagnostic. And we must move beyond that concept. We must start to look at what is right for that patient and how do we integrate the various component parts for that individual patient. And the good news, because we're all here to be incented at the table, is that when we take that step, when we walk towards that integrated future, there is a higher return on investment. Mark, back to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Peter. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Suri. And again, lots of questions coming in. Just type them into the box, and we can address them now. We've got a few minutes to address your questions. The first question is for Peter. Peter, you mentioned 1.0 is asset specific, and 2.0 is more portfolio disease specific. How can a pharma company focus on moving from an asset to a portfolio?
Yeah, very good question. Again, you know, we very much understand the current, you know, drug model. It obviously needs to take great cognizance of the development pathway and the moving parts that are associated with one individual drug. And we're not suggesting that needs to shift. What we're saying is that is augmented with a broader view of how that individual asset and then perhaps complementary assets that are further back in that pipeline are going to be applied and are going to be integrated into clinical practice. And the problem with the asset focus and the way that pharma, in our view, has constructed this focus around the asset is that no one's thinking about that other part. No one's thinking about how that level of integration is going on. What's happening in the complementary diagnostics industry? What's happening within healthcare IT? Yes, we are observing it, but no one's sitting down saying, how do we take those assets and integrate them into clinical practice? So it's not just a portfolio approach. I think it's augmenting that asset model with another level, another team, perhaps a centralized team that is thinking about how that's going to roll and play into integrated clinical practice. And to reach out to those key opinion leaders and those stakeholders that currently are somewhat distant, I think, from that asset focus within pharma.
Great. And here's a follow-up to that. Is this relevant only to oncology, where the RX is empiric?
Definitely not. I think two comments I would make there. First of all, is the observations, the things that we are learning in oncology are going to roll out and are going to play in other diseases, whether they be autoimmune, cardiovascular, and in neurology. And the level of work that is ongoing in those fields resembles where oncology was 5, 6, 7 years ago. So it is coming to those other disease areas. But I think what we can take from what we're learning in oncology and the burden that I think we've imposed on some of our stakeholders is I think we can learn from that and take a different and a more holistic and a more integrated approach to those other disease areas. And I think that's what's exciting.
Great. And here's a question for Tiffany. How do you see PM 2.0 impacting health systems as the transition from volume to value?
So how I look at PM 2.0 impacting the entire health system is when you look at some of the changes that are going on in the health system today. So, for instance, the ACOs, which are forming in the USA, where CMS is basing the right now 154 ACOs on their reimbursement on 33 quality measurements and also readmission rates. So the health system now is even more geared at the outcomes and what they can do in order to improve those outcomes and those quality measurements. You saw on one of Peter's slides that the losers in melanoma were hospitals because of the hospital-based surgeries. But actually, they can also look at that because as they become responsible for the patient and the impact and the outcomes of that patient population, this type of information becomes extremely important. And I think that by looking at integrating all of these decisions in the hospital, becoming more concerned on that total cost and utilizing less healthcare waste, that it's extremely important for that whole entire health system.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. So a question about the supply chain for Peter. How does the supply chain adapt to PM and companion diagnostics? And he put in parentheses wholesalers and GPOs.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant, it's a very insightful question. Because what it's really looking back and considering this as a total journey, as an integrated journey, and looking at not just the therapy that's coming into play, but the diagnostics, the healthcare information that's coming to play, and where they co-join along that supply chain into clinical practice. And what we suspect is going to happen is that we're going to have imperfections in that supply chain in the short term. We're not going to have all the component parts there. Maybe in a 5, 10, 15-year horizon, that supply chain starts to become much more efficient. But in our view today, and we cited melanoma here, the supply chain in melanoma, with a little bit of sponsorship, a little bit of integration, a little bit of collaboration with the translational medicine community, is the types of component parts that can be brought into play in melanoma are pretty near at hand. They're certainly within a 5 to 10 year horizon, not in a 15 to 20 year horizon.
Great. Here's another question. I'll throw it to everyone. You mentioned potential increased role of the rep in the conversation with the provider. Since science will invariably become more complex, what about MSL as the more effective communicator for PM innovation?
Suri, do you want to handle that one?
Absolutely. No, I think it's a perfect opportunity for MSLs in this area. And actually, we also asked that question about MSLs, and that was equally important in terms of welcoming an MSL into the office. So we actually did ask that question as well. And because it's more of a consultative, scientific message, it's definitely more appropriate for the MSLs. And I just wanted to mention, we were talking about the oncologist before. One of the reasons why we included the primary care physician in our study is because we strongly believe that they will be the gatekeepers as we move forward, particularly when it comes to identifying high-risk patients. For instance, sending a patient for a BRCA test. That conversation might actually first take place in the primary care office. So we felt that it's important to also get a reading on the primary care physician and their current interest and understanding of personalized medicine.
Great, thanks. So we've got time for a few more questions. The next one is for Tiffany. Tiffany, you've been on both the RX and DX side. What are the key points for partnering between the two?
I think that the key points between partnering between the two is really a good understanding of the needs of both of them. I've seen the most successful diagnostic companies working with pharma are the ones that truly understand the challenges that are involved in drug development and where diagnostic needs to fit in and getting in early. It's really never too early to start that conversation with the partner. And pharma moves at a very, very different pace than diagnostics. And the really successful pharma companies are those that have people on the team that truly understand diagnostics, some of the nuances that are involved. Diagnostics is a very nuanced industry between the different types of regulations that you can go for, especially in the beginning when it wasn't clear what needs to be a PMA. But there's still discussion on LDT versus FDA. But having people on the team that can understand that. I see the new area where both pharma and diagnostics needs to move into is the commercialization. Because what typically happens is that the discussion comes based just on the companion, not on the entire patient journey and where patients are going to be being touched by different diagnostics. And then commercialization is just kind of left there. We're seeing some of that, our partners reaching out to us saying, help us with the commercialization and the integration of all of those things that need to happen.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. So I think we've got time for one more question. Let's take this question, which kind of relates to that, around next